Chapter 11 The Stygian Man. After it was all over, Aemon told me he never had any intention of keeping his end of the bargain with the Dalphane. His plan, from the moment Lairad informed him of the Rhodeshi prize, was to seize the embryos for himself. The negotiation was only a matter of hedging, that should things go wrong, should Aemon be unable to seize humanity's last chance for survival, that hopefully we would not be abused too harshly under the Dalphane sponsorship. A wistful fantasy that I had thoroughly disabused him of. But Aemon couldn't hope to take the embryos alone. Once he won the death games, he wouldn't simply be able to load his prize into the Ophelian's hold and take off, not without the Dalphane attempting to stop him. And so, he needed assistance. He needed the help of the one organization in the galaxy both willing to commit a capital offense against the Dalphane ascendancy and to not extort a similarly heavy price for such an act. Our journey took us halfway down the spiral arm to a small territory known as the Malavon sector, otherwise known as the last battlefield of the Fifth Aberrant War. Most of the planets in this area of space were razed into burning hellscapes or otherwise shattered into mineral-rich asteroid clusters. The relays here had been rebuilt into basic ring structures and opened the way back for lucrative mining operations. Never mind that this was supposed to be human territory. Never mind that those were our worlds. The harsh truth was that we no longer had the capacity to defend ourselves, and so the greedy eyes of the galaxy fell upon these systems to take what they could. The treaties were all violated before we could even send ships for our dead. Their corpses were harvested from high orbit of the ruined planets they gave their lives to defend. Aemon took us to a lonely system on the edge of the sector. We approached on a tiny moon orbiting a lava world. The burning planet, now known as Tartarus, had dozens of high-orbit drills burrowing through the crust and extracting raw material. This ore was then taken to the single moon known as Coitis, where it was refined and processed for shipping contracts across the spiral arm. Watching from a viewport, I saw the growing black moon drenched in crimson light from its blistering partner. The mining facilities were shaped like ghastly ziggurats, with long, thin fingers stretching out across the surface. They were the only buildings I could see, poking above a diffuse cloud of pitch darkness that covered the entire landscape. I learned then that smoke doesn't rise in low gravity. It simply spreads and spreads, staining everything it touches. In a way, not even Baron Coitis was spared from the war. The Ophelian sat down on one of the metal landing strips. Clamps fastened onto the ship as hydraulics lowered the landing platform into an enclosed hangar. The iron groaned and screeched as the doors shut above and the interior space was pressurized. Unlike the pristine world of Naiad, this hangar was covered in ash and grease. Cables hung loosely from the ceiling. Grimy orange spotlights thunked on from the floor. The steel looked rusted and weathered under hundreds of years of neglect. And when the airlock opened, I tasted putrid air that was not dissimilar to that of Giza 6. We had arrived at Adjunct Refinery 57.
Why must it go this time around?
Ingrish clung to me as the landing ramp descended on the dingy platform.
It's not for another assassination, I hope.
This place reeks, but it's not dangerous, Aemon replied, tapping on his gauntlet screen. In fact, it's one of the few places in the galaxy I would feel safe having him wander around.
Really?
Ingrish cocked her head at him unamused. Aemon glanced up at her. Where would you have him go? Naiad? That place is 10 times more dangerous for a human. No one on this dump is going to recognize what Vass is. Worst that can happen is that some lowlife will mark him as a target. And then I'll leave said lowlife a bloodstain on a bulkhead.
I know, but what if something...
If Vass is going to stick with us on the Ophelian, and I mean for the long haul, I need him tough. If he can't handle Coitis, that's going to be a problem. You and I both know we'll be heading for far worse.
He's still a child.
A child who survived Giza 6. If I didn't think he would be up for it, I would have taken him to Sanctuary. Ingrish crossed her arms, trying one last bid to win the argument.
But he still can't understand words well, and I'm not permitted down, so he's staying.
Amon nodded towards me. What do you think? Do you want to come along with me? Part of me wanted to stay on the Aphelion, true, but this seemed my only opportunity to enjoy a semblance of the freedom I had on Giza 6, and I did not know when such a moment would arise again. And besides, practically on first breath, this place was already much more comfortable to me than Naiad ever was. I nodded my head. Amon shrugged his shoulders. See, he understands well enough. And if you're still concerned, call for Kybit. She's a good enough translator in the meantime. Ingrish tilted her head in annoyance at Amon before stomping back into the Aphelion. Amon pulled his pistol out of his holster and checked it. In a strange way, I suddenly felt a new kinship with him. We were both comfortable treading in the dark places of the galaxy, although for entirely different reasons. Turning to me, Amon hesitated before he spoke, trying to choose simple enough words for me to understand. Finally, he looked me in the eye. She wants to protect you, more than anything. I do too, but I can't have you weak, I'm sorry. We humans can't be weak anymore. It was not the content of his words that shook me to my core. Rather, it was that this was the first conversation I grasped the basic meaning of without Ingrish's help. I was so astonished that I glanced behind, expecting her to still be there, translating in the background. For myself, I had never known language to be something of clarity, of comprehension, and I was so startled that all I could do was nod in response. Several minutes later, we were joined by Amon's Nekomata. Unlike Maya, Kybit was entirely sculpted as a human. Her porcelain features were just as expressive, and her neural cables were tied back in a long braid that fell to her waist. She wrinkled her nose at the air and straightened her white jumpsuit, evidently disgusted with the state of the refinery. Follow and watch Vass for me, Amon ordered, and he started walking down the landing ramp, boots thudding heavily on the slanted surface. I followed quickly behind with Kybit bringing up the rear. Amon approached a cog-shaped door at the end of the hangar. Practically every hatch was its own airlock here, and they were built sturdy, with only a smeared plate of reinforced glass to peer through the other side. Amon tapped on a flickering keypad and both cogs hissed as they unsealed and rolled into the wall. Behind was a long promenade filled with shops and aliens. The segmented ceiling was low and covered in hollow advertisements and faded banners and graffiti. Vents hissed loud steam as the throng of the busy concourse deafened my ears. Most of the aliens were of a furred, snarling species with broad snouts and beady eyes. They wore dark spacesuits that seemed caked in layers of sweat and oils and whatever other foul substances there were on this moon. Eyes glanced our way, but surprisingly, no one seemed to pay the strange newcomers any mind. It seemed visitors were not uncommon in this place. Amon pushed his way through the crowds, and we tailed him. Although it was difficult for me to keep an eye on Amon as well as gawk at my surroundings. I saw vendors peddling baubles from makeshift stalls of sheet metal. I saw crusting ration dispensaries with long trailing lines. I saw bars and gambling dens and other establishments filled with raucous activity. You could hear muffled banging music everywhere, and the place burned the nose after a while. Amon walked purposefully with a destination in mind, only occasionally taking a turn at intersections or pausing to let a large rabble pass by. I noticed Kybit had entirely dropped her disgusted demeanor, it itself a personality heuristic to endear her to conventional species. She strolled with an entirely flat expression, scanning for potential threats and making sure I remained behind Amon. At last, Amon stopped in front of some sort of storage repository in a more quiet part of the promenade. Out front, a neon sign read something in words I could not understand. Though looking through the steel grate window, I saw a low-lit lounge and a counter. A single feathered alien, not unlike Riker, manned the desk. Behind him was a wall of many lockers, and off to the side, a thick steel door, presumably to a vault of some kind. The alien perked its head up as Amon entered. He squinted eyes at the man, as if not believing his own vision was telling him the truth. The alien was incapable of smiling, and yet its beak somehow smirked.
Amon Ross,
The alien slowly said.
it's nice to finally meet you.
Amon glanced around, unimpressed. Where's Cocoa?
Cocoa died 3 decades ago. I'm Desra, his son.
The bird cackled, tapping his taloned finger on the desk.
When I took over the business, he made me memorize all the special customers. You were the last one to make an appearance, too. Was wondering when you would finally come calling.
Amon blinked, his fists clenching. Is it safe?
As safe as can be.
The bird staggered around the counter and beckoned towards the vault. Clicking a few buttons on a remote, the steel hydraulics retracted and the door opened to a narrow passage. We silently followed the bird down the unassuming corridor where we were made to stand in front of several scanners embedded in the wall, each checking us for some unknown purpose. Finally, at the end, the bird clicked another remote, and another door opened. We were ushered into a wide, dark space. It looked like it had been repurposed from a ship's cargo hold, with a single walkway suspended along the center of the great void. Down below, the floor was comprised of storage boxes protected by a laser lattice. The low, greenish light was the only illumination in the room, probably to hide more discreet security measures. Desra bowed and departed, leaving us to our own devices. Proceeding down the gangway, Amon stood in front of another terminal that took a retinal scan. A hydraulic arm attached to the wall whined into motion as it dipped down and grabbed one particular box. It yanked it back up and presented the container to Amon. The last security measure seemed to be of Amon's own design. A bulky clamp fastened the box shut, and taking the container into his hands, Amon spoke a single word. Coitis. The clamp snapped open, and Amon put it aside as he opened the storage box. I got on my tiptoes to peek at what was inside the container. Tucked away on some cloth was a dark cube that could fit in the palm of one's hand. Soft blue wiring ran along its surface, and at the top was an opening for some kind of projector. I'll make an account here in your name in case you ever need this, Amon told me as he took the cube and gave me a closer look. It's called a quantum encoder. Human technology. It allows for communication with a paired sister cube. Coitis' translation was much shakier than English's, but I understood it was a powerful communication device. Actually, it was the most powerful communication instrument you could physically create, able to work instantly across the known universe.
But who?
I asked, confused with who Amon would be talking with. Amon glanced down at me. Someone who owes me a favor. Amon released me and Coitis to wander while he returned to the Aphelion to privately meet with his contacts. I am sure many would rightfully question Amon's judgment, and I do not blame those who do not understand the ways of humanity. Amon was not lying when he said Naiad was far more dangerous for me than the slums of a decrepit mining facility. Out there, in the midst of civilization, you had aliens prowling with temporal nets and proton disruptors and targeted nanoparalytics. And all of them, with a quick check from a viviscanner, would be able to identify just how valuable I was. Meanwhile, on Coitis, there was nothing but slug pistols, knives, and your own steel fiber muscles. Let's say the worst happened, and I was involved in a firefight. Immediately, Amon's evosuit would have injected him with adreno stims purchased and restocked from the reward money he obtained on Naiad. No one would be getting their weapon out of the holster, let alone walking from the room alive. It was, in a very twisted sense, safer for me in the scum dens of the galaxy than it was in the sparkling palaces of civilization. And so brazenly leaving me with Coitis? Yes, the Nekomata was my translator. But she, a standard maintenance unit produced and sold by the Delphane, also happens to be the most dangerous weapon in 500 light years. There was also one other thing that counted in my favor. From what I have learned of antiquity, it was those who were clueless, the ones who stood out from a crowd, who were preyed upon. In the present, it is precisely the clumsy who are left alone. Because, be it out of sight, they were certainly wearing an ion shield or guarded by invisible servo drones, ready to tear apart limbs at a moment's notice. I could have walked the length and breadth of Coitis without someone daring to lay a hand on me. And on that promenade, I did. Coitis carefully steered me away from the less reputable parts of the already disreputable Refinery 57, and instead we wandered down the long, winding bazaars. I was most fond of the vendors selling bits of technology, especially anything that was flashy. I liked watching the whirring of power cores or the bubbling of energy bricks. Once or twice I had to be stopped by Coitis, attempting to walk away with some shiny object in hand. While I was aware of the concept of stealing, the Mansa do not have markets like other species. On Giza 6, it was assumed that if wares were out in the open, they could be requisitioned. I never had the opportunity to use this privilege as a Xeno-Urtaf, but I was no longer an Urtaf. I was something else. As we continued walking, I do not know what drew my attention to the Anansi, the hooded alien with whiskered black skin. It was sitting on a ragged carpet with an open lockbox filled with meal chips. The alien had placed itself a distance from the other vendors, taking up a quiet corner as it sat and waited. I paused over the creature, studying the alien as its two leathery hands jittered on its knees. Noticing my curiosity, the alien spoke in a language which Kuipet translated, even while she was distracted and scanning the crowds.
It is asking you whether you would like to know your future,
She said.
I do not understand.
I replied.
Future. It means your unresolved past.
I nodded at the alien, unsure of what to expect next. The Anansi held out its whiskered hand, evidently wanting something from me. After a few seconds of awkward silence, Kuipet was forced to intervene.
There are a countless multitude of species in the galaxy, and none of them can tell the future. Not even your kind could peer through the time-sealed vortexes. This alien is trying to trick you out of value. I suggest we move on.
Ironically, Kuipet had said the exact opposite of what would have dissuaded me from the scam artist. It did not matter to me that the creature was a fake. What was endlessly fascinating, however, was how this alien could persuade me that it could see the future. In other words, I was far more interested in the idea of a scam than I was in its purported abilities. I pointed to the alien again, gesturing for Kuipet to do whatever she needed for the fortune teller. The Nekomata rolled her eyes and she lifted her wrist. Plucking a cred chip from a slot, she dropped it in the lockbox. The Anansi gestured for me to sit down on the rug. It took out 3 scented candles and lit them, placing the waxen lights in a triangle surrounding us. The wicks from the metallic canisters released a powdery incense that choked the throat. Swaying back and forth, the alien began chanting something that was unintelligible. I glanced at Kuipet, but she kept scanning the crowds, evidently not willing to entertain the alien's gibberish. Turning back, I saw the creature had thrown off its hood. Its many-faceted eyes were red and entirely opaque. A mandible jaw clicked in chorus with the sounds the creature made with its throat. It was shaking rhythmically, clicking to some silent song that only it could hear. Suddenly, it stopped, and it lifted its eyes to the ceiling. The Anansi held up its arms and waved in the air, as if pulling a prophecy from nothingness itself. Finally, after a long second, the alien looked back down. It rushed, mumbling as it tried to grab me. I was so startled I couldn't react, but Kuipet had her hand on the creature's arm before I could blink. With a single twitch of her wrist, she lurched the alien's arm in its socket and slammed the Anansi to the ground, grinding its head against the reeking rug.
You shall not touch him,
Kuipet calmly told the alien. The wild energy of the Anansi was gone. The creature hastily nodded its head in agreement, deep in fear of the cold Nekomata. For myself, I crossed my arms, disappointed that the show was over before it began. Kuipet had broken the mystique, and I knew then that the creature would not be able to persuade me that it could see the future. Kuipet slowly let go of the Anansi, and the alien reluctantly picked itself up. Obviously now, wanting to get the whole thing over with, it raised its bristly fingers to my forehead, careful this time not to touch me. And here is the only really interesting thing about the Anansi race. As I have learned, what Kuipet said was true. No species of my time had the ability to see into the future. However, the Anansi had garnered something of a reputation because while they could not see into the future, they could impart mimetic commands into the subject. The hypnotized person would go on to fulfill the prophecy. This little-known secret was how they worked their trade and received repeat customers. The Anansi opened its mouth, but just as it was about to speak, its voice caught in its throat. The alien suddenly seized, much unlike before. It was like it had lost control over its own body and was fighting to get free. Coitis had yanked me back in a split second, dragging me away from the hooded alien before it could do anything else. The Anansi choked on its own breath and shrieked so loud that all the surrounding aliens turned towards the commotion. Coitis was pulling me as hard as she could, trying to get me as far from the scene as possible. I caught one last look at the Anansi. The alien was staring straight at me. I had never seen such a frightened expression in my life. It was as if it looked upon some horror let loose from dread stars, like it knew some unimaginable, terrible secret that it could not speak. Whatever had seized the alien suddenly let go, and the creature shuddered with one last horrifying jolt. Blood spurted out of the Anansi's eyes, and the false prophesier fell over on the ground, dead.